Hello everyone and welcome to the next video going into the urinary system. So in this video we're going to look at the inner structures and functions of what's called the nephron. So the nephron is this little loop, and that's where reabsorption and secretion is made. And then some of these loops also help in making concentrated urine for when you are dehydrated so that you don't lose too much water. All right, let's get into this now. And so that's what we're going to be going into, the structures and functions of the nephron. So we're going to be looking a little bit more inside the kidneys only today, and looking at some more gross anatomy and mostly microscopic anatomy. So continuing with the gross anatomy here, the kidney has one, we talked about how the renal artery comes in and then the renal vein goes back out. But first, just looking at the renal artery, renal vein, and there's also a renal nerve. All that comes in at the renal hilum right here. So the arteries come in. See it coming in right here, then can branch out into these different parts inside the kidney. As it branches out, you see how they can go in between the lobes. They're called the interlobal arteries, and here they then arch out, or they're called the arcuate arteries. Well, I'll show these a little better coming up down here. And then up here, the arcuate arteries, this is where they would then feed into a structure called a glomulari, or a glomerulus, which are these little balls that we'll show later. And so that's where filtration then happens. And then whatever blood is reabsorbed, whatever fluid is reabsorbed, comes back the veins, arcuate veins, interlobal veins, and then back out. So what happens in this little spot right here, and that's where we're having the main events in the kidney going on, that filtration, reabsorption, and secretion happening. So this is all known as the cortex right here. So here it's labeled down here, the renal cortex. The outer connective tissue layering is just called the capsule. And then, so as this comes in, so imagine we're blood coming in here, getting filtered, it then goes through this tubular network. There's a proximal tube, there's a little loop that forms, and then there's a distal tube. And then eventually all of these drain down through via collecting ducts. So it ends up happening, we get these little pyramids that form. They're called the renal medulla or medullary pyramids. And they have these little striping patterns on them. And these little stripes that you see on them are actually these collecting ducts that we're going to talk about later. So these collecting ducts come down in and then all empty into, well, at the end of the tip of the pyramid, called the renal papilla. And then here's where urine is formed. So, well, not formed, it's where it ends up. So the first part where it exits right here is called the minor calyx, and then a couple minor calyxes come together to then form the major calyx. So there's a couple major calyxes right there. And then they then join right here at an area called the renal pelvis before all that urine exits via the ureter. So if you were to get a kidney stone or something like that, typically they can form in these calyces and then can cause a lot of pain and discomfort, especially if that kidney stone gets into the ureter then as well when you begin to pass it. There are different ways to try to break up kidney stones though. So that is just a general overview here of the cortex, these medullary pyramids, and these calyxes for the pathway blood takes coming through. So, but what we're really going to be focused on here is what happens in this cortex, because that's where, besides the collecting ducts coming down through, that's where most of this magic happens. This image right here is just showing the breakdown of the blood vessels coming in. So the renal artery comes in, branches into something called the segmental artery, and then goes in between the different lobes. So here, this would go out and become the interlobal artery then. And then, like we talked about, they arch out as the arcuate. And then they also, arcing out like this. And then they radiate out from the arches. And that's where we have what are called the cortical radiate arteries. Now, you see right here are these little spots. These little spots then, this is what that little spot is, those little dots. This is called a glomerulus. So where this cortical radiate artery comes up, it branches off into an arterial capillary bed. So usually capillary beds go arteries to veins. However, this one is all artery because it's a higher pressure bed. So what happens is the blood comes in and it pushes the filtrate out right here inside what's called a glomerulus, this tuft of capillaries. I'll show a better picture of one later. And this filtrate, all the fluid that's pushed out gets taken up into this tubular network. So this is called the proximal convoluted tubule, and then it comes down this loop of Henle right here, and then back up this distal convoluted tubule, and then eventually out the collecting duct. But so you have an afferent. Afferent is arriving arterial, and then an efferent arterial exiting this glomerulus. So here, whatever is remaining in the blood is here. And what's remaining after you push all the filtrate out, you have large proteins like albumin, you have your red blood cells are the major components. All small ions, all small molecules, so sodium, water, glucose, things like that go into these tubule networks. Everything else remains in here, and it's a high concentration coming in right here. And that high concentration, whatever gets pulled out here, gets pulled back into the blood then, and that's what tubular reabsorption means. Reabsorption means it gets reabsorbed back into your blood. So here it enters a capillary network called the peritubular capillaries, which surround these nephrons, and then when they exit, they come back out the cortical radiate veins and back out through the renal vein. So the key is what happens in here now. That's what the point of this video is all about, and that's called the nephron loop. And that's where we have to go deeper into this microscopic anatomy, and we look at the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is that glomerulus. So here it's this capsule. Sometimes this can be referred to as the Bowman's capsule. So it forms this little structure around this tuft of capillaries so that when blood comes through this afferent arteriole, it pushes out these different fenestrations of these cells, these podocytes that surround these capillaries. So the fluid comes out, and just as long as you have a net push of this fluid out, it will then come into the proximal convoluted tubule. And then whatever's remaining again, like red blood cells, large proteins, exits then out the efferent arteriole. Now, one difference here is the afferent is actually larger than the efferent. The efferent's small. So this is a larger tube, and this is a smaller tube for exiting. That causes an increase in pressure in here and helps push more filtration out. That filtration pressure is called net filtration pressure, and it leads to something called your glomerular filtration rate, which can be a diagnostic tool for looking at renal or kidney function. So your GFR, glomerular filtration rate, and that's the number they use if you're being checked for like kidney disease or renal failure and whatnot. There are some other cells here that are monitoring it. So here you have the distal convoluted tubule coming up. And so this is what has gone through the reabsorption and secretion process. So whatever is returning here will likely be urine. So these macula densa cells are checking the salt concentrations there and then informing these other juxtaglomerular cells here on whether or not they need to slow down or increase the rate of fluids coming in here to set those ion concentrations exactly. They can also release that hormone called renin to then increase that angiotensin aldosterone to also monitor blood pressure. So they're looking at what's returning right there from that system. But I mentioned these tubes, this loop of Henle or nephron loop, and there's what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. In this tube, we're doing reabsorption and secretion. Remember, reabsorption is what comes back into your blood, and secretion is what becomes urine. And then, so here you enter here, you then go through the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, this is all in the cortex right now. Remember, the cortex is this region right here. So this is all in that cortex. So that's the proximal, meaning the first convoluted tubule, and most reabsorption occurs right there. And I'll show an image coming up here later of what exactly is happening in each section. And then here we have the loop of Henle or the nephron loop. So this comes down and back up. There's a thin descending limb and a thick ascending limb. So it comes down this way and back up this way. So a thin and a thick limb on this, and that helps regulate things like this one's more specific. A lot for the PCT or proximal convoluted tubule, there's a lot of different things that can be reabsorbed and secreted there. Here, for the thin and thick things, we're only mainly talking about sodium and water and a little bit of potassium. So we'll talk about that in a second here. And then we get to the DCT, or the distal convoluted tubule. So it comes up and wraps around one little bit again for a little bit more of checks to see what's exiting here. Also checks those sodium ion concentrations. Remember I said how the DCT was this structure right here. So it's checking what's about to enter the final collecting area called the collecting duct. The collecting duct is then what gives that striped pattern to the renal pyramids, and then so it flows into the renal papilla, which is the tip of the pyramid, and then goes into the minor calyx, major calyx, and then eventually the ureters, of course. So we talked about that up here, the renal pelvis, and then the ureter. So that's how it drains out then. So when we look at these different parts of these tubes, let me zoom out just a tiny bit on this image here. We have the glomerulus, but what's happening? So here, I guess that's a purple color, and this would be a more of a yellow color. Purple, what's being reabsorbed. So reabsorption is happening there, and then this is secretion. Remember, secretion is what becomes urine. So for reabsorption, glucose is a big one. So if someone has diabetes or they're hyperglycemic, have a lot of glucose in their blood, you get a lot more glucose in the filtrate. And the problem with that is less water comes out. So water is a big one here. If less water comes out, that means more water is exiting. And that's why, because of glucose, high concentration means less water is reabsorbed back into the blood. So glycosuria is high levels of glucose in the urine. And if there are high levels of glucose in the urine, then that increased urinary output as a result. So that's one thing to think about for glucose. But here you see amino acids, proteins, vitamins, lactate. Urea and uric acid do get reabsorbed here, but they do come back in down here and over here. So some things can move back and forth as well. Then here's your electrolyte balances. So all your important electrolytes and things like that. So you see most reabsorption takes place in the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule. And then around all of these, you would have capillaries. So you have what are called your paratubular capillaries around this right here. Here you would have, the veins around that as well. So you would have your capillaries surrounding all of that. This image kind of showed those capillaries. It doesn't show the veins too much though. And then we go down the loop of Henle. For the loop of Henle, we have the thin limb coming down. For the thin limb coming down, that's where water reabsorption takes place. And then coming back up, we have the thick limb where sodium, potassium, and chloride ions are being reabsorbed. And then the distal convoluted tubule, there's a little bit of reabsorption of some final sodium electrolytes, bicarbonate ions for pH in water. But here it's primarily secretion for ammonia, potassium, and hydrogen ions as well. Then we enter the collecting duct where we get the final water concentration. So this is where we have these two mechanisms that we're not going to talk about in this course, but that's where urine concentration is made. So if your urine is darker in color, that means you're reabsorbing more water and you're dehydrated. If it's lighter in color, it means there's more water in it and you're hydrated. So, but your blood pressure and things like that stays relatively constant blood volume wise, and that's because your collecting duct is what's regulating the concentration of urine based on the concentration in your body, how much water you have. Now, we didn't really talk too much about it here, but these loops of Henle, some of them can just be cortical, meaning they're just mainly up here in the cortex and they don't come down too far. Some of them are called juxtaglomerular, where they actually go further down into the pyramids right here. And then around them are capillaries called the vasa recta. The capillaries up here are just called the paratubular capillaries. Down here you have the vasa recta capillaries. And the vasa recta, along with these juxtaglomerular deep loops of Henle here, these are creating concentrated urine for when those collecting ducts drain down through here, because they're affecting the concentration. So when you get down to the bottom, becomes a very high concentration, and that can change the collecting ducts. A little bit too much info there for you all, so don't worry too much about it. Different hormones can also have effects on the kidneys too. So we talked about antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone actually puts aquaporins into this collecting duct to increase reabsorption of water. Aldosterone. Aldosterone, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, adds sodium channels to different parts here. It can add them to the ascending limb, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule. But increases sodium reabsorption. If you increase sodium, water from antidiuretic hormone will follow. So it's all linked, and so forth. And water follows sodium. Water will follow the higher concentration. So hormones play a role here. There are other hormones that can have an effect in here. But again, this is just a general overview of this loop of Henle and a little hint of the functions and the physiology of what's going on in it. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me know and reach out. But I hope you enjoyed learning about how urine is formed in your kidneys and the overall features of the urinary system. All right, hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.